Sam, he's our man.
God, it's like I am a prepper. I look like one, kind of. The only thing I'm missing is a hologram and repeating dialogue. Oh, hello everyone. It's been a while, long hiatus, and I'm back to kind of talk about some of the media that I've been consuming as of late, especially with coronavirus, this epidemic, this international pandemic. I've had a lot of downtime, probably too much of it, unfortunately. I think a lot of us can speak to that, though. I have been consuming two pieces of media primarily over this duration, if you will. I didn't even plan for it, but I think the timeliness of it can't be overstated. I watched a playthrough of Pathologic 1, and I'm playing Death Stranding, the latter of which is the subject of this video. I think it's funny because I'm playing both of these games, and I was playing them prior to this epidemic, but both of them have something to do with that epidemic in some way, because Pathologic is a Plague Doctor game, so the connection there is obvious, and Death Stranding is a game about social isolation. Now, for Pathologic, that was a game. That was something, alright. I definitely want to play its sequel instead of watching it, because according to all accounts, Pathologic 2 is a masterpiece of gaming. However, Pathologic 1, while it had its brilliant moments, I could tell it was flawed. I watched Keith Ballard, I believe is his name. His playthrough. It was a great playthrough, fantastic job, and he was good at the game, which was also cool. But anyway, it's a flawed game, and I'm also playing Death Stranding. I think it's funny because they're actually kind of similar games in terms of, like, thematic pacing and their flow, because Death Stranding, in a sense, is a survival game, just like Pathologic, in that you have meters, and meter management is kind of like the core gameplay. But with Death Stranding, it's less so a survival game and more of a delivery game. You're literally a delivery man, delivering packages, and I think the internet has made enough memes about it. I think we all know what Death Stranding's premise is and what its gameplay loop is. I'm not here to talk about that as much, though I will kind of briefly talk about that. So, for Death Stranding, me personally, I like the game a lot. I think it's a really good game, and I'm not just saying that as a Kojima fan. I think he's a flawed but exemplary visionary, and Death Stranding is a great game in my eyes. Not necessarily, it's one of those games in a sense like Pathologic that is not always fun, but at the same time that is not a bad thing. Like, it's a well-designed game, but it's not always fun, if that makes sense, because like the core of what you're doing, no matter how you slice it, is going to be somewhat tedious in the fact that what you're doing is literally walking back and forth across the map and delivering things. So one thing that I love about Death Stranding, and even its dislikers can admit to this, or at least some of them, it's all a matter of opinion though, so whichever you believe is fine. That's kind of just, it's that type of game. But the story is remarkably interesting. And I'm very curious to see how it goes. I haven't finished it yet, but I've gotten far enough in. I'm on episode 7? Yeah, 7, Hartman. And I think it's really fascinating, and not just because of its cool supernatural apocalypse scenario, which, don't get me wrong, that's interesting and fascinating, and I want to see where that goes, but also because of its social psychological dystopia, which is something that you don't really see in games very often, and I think it's remarkable that Kojima took this theme and made it the core of the game. When I say social psychological dystopia, I'm referring to the overarching world building of the game being centered on this idea of loneliness and isolation and a lack of social connection as a big problematic driving force in the game's world, in the society that's in the game. What you see are people who are not incredibly far apart from each other because you have to walk. I mean, there's a gameplay reason for it more than a story reason, but you see people who are isolated. They're quarantined, they're self-quarantined for whatever reason, and it's because America is not what it once was in the story. It's a bunch of disparate city-states. It's almost Nier-esque in that sense, like this feudal sort of thing. Except there's no kings, it's just kind of like anarchy. There was a faction, the UCA, the United Cities of America, that was like a governing force, but they're having trouble keeping everyone on the same page, which is where you come in as a porter, a delivery man, who they task with reconnecting their network. I noticed immediately there's this emphasis on the psychology of isolation in Death Stranding. So you have the mules, who are delivery men like you, who are hooked on making deliveries, for example. And that is a fascinating concept that isn't altogether implausible. It's a little exaggerated, like that doesn't happen overnight, but that's actually part of the game's story, which is remarkably unique as far as a dystopian setting. The last time Kojima did a pure dystopia was Metal Gear Solid 4. That game also had a cool premise for its he's good at picking an idea for a dystopian setting, I find. Because this being his second attempt at it, that I know of. I know that Zone of the Enders and Snatcher and Police Knots are a thing, but I don't know much about those games, though I could look into them, and I might. He's great at picking a modern day idea and weaving that into the story as a matter of, well, if things progress, they would get to this state. I don't see many people talking about the social media angle that Death Stranding goes for, and how honestly kind of brilliant it is. You have these people, the mules are hooked on deliveries, that's one aspect of the story that's interesting, and they explain it as an adrenaline rush, and that ties into the core deprivation of the game, which is oxytocin. Now, oxytocin is a key neurotransmitter, and the game explains this, so I'm kind of just reiterating what the game says, but it's a key neurotransmitter involved in a mixture of pleasure and satisfaction and other things. In Death Stranding's world, there's apparently a lack of it because of the fact that people are isolated. Now, that's interesting because it seems to happen on such a broad scale that it actually is a physical thing that people have to replenish. And oxytocin is something that you do indeed replenish naturally, but the supposition in Death Stranding, at least to my knowledge, people are so socially isolated that they're almost in withdrawal. I said that very poorly. They're withdrawing from a lack of oxytocin. That is a wacky idea. It even extends to the game's aesthetic and its social strand system, which I will discuss now, and which I think is honestly probably one of the game's most brilliant aspects. The social strand system is an interesting system in that it's not exactly a novel idea. It's more of a hybrid between the Dark Souls shared single-player world concept of we have a map that is a single-player map and you're the only one on it, at least in many cases in Dark Souls games, for example. We have that map, and then we have a shared version of that map that's projected onto everyone's game. And that is online all the time, so people's structures are in the game. It's a hybrid between single player and multiplayer. That's nothing new. I think it's cool that we have a term for it now, the strand system. What's cool about it in terms of this social psychological dystopia, it takes that concept of hyper-dependency on oxytocin, which is in a way a real-life version of a social media site. you see throughout the game, you're awarded likes for completing missions. There's a lot of tangible versions of a reward system that you would see on a social media platform, like a like or a comment or an emoji or something like that. And that even extends to characters' emails and their conversations with you. For example, characters will do a thumbs up and then you get likes physically in the game, or like you'll do something for a character and they'll give you likes or something like that. And it's almost like satirical in a sense. They're so dependent on the rush that you get from a like or an emoji, or the emotions, the warm fuzzy feelings that you may or may not get when you see a smiley emoji, for example, because it's a cute cartoony image. That sort of ties into the whole social strand system, and that is a reflection of the digital age. So I think Death Stranding is more nuanced and fascinating than a lot of people give it credit for. Like, at least from what I see, a lot of people talk about like the tediousness of it and it being kind of loaded and pretentious. As someone who likes the game, I wouldn't necessarily dispute that. I think it's one of those games, Death Stranding, so far from what I can tell, it's just one of those games that you're not right or wrong, whatever your opinion of the game is, as long as you make sense. What the game should do is just cut back on the side content. That would be my recommendation for it, because the game is really at its best when you're doing like a single delivery to a place that you haven't been before. It's because then you're doing a simultaneous like exploration mixed with atmosphere, mixed with meter management, so it feels like a Pathologic or a survival game. Now in that, you're kind of like constantly moving. Yeah, you're walking over the same map, but you have like one objective at a time, or like 3 maybe. It's not managing cargo in the same way, because that part is a little cumbersome in Death Stranding. You're like, I just want to get to that place, but I have like 3 orders that I'm juggling, and I don't want to abandon any of them because that's the point. But then I have to leave stuff in this private locker, then I have to go back and forth and get it, and it's like that part isn't as fun. For going back to the game's themes, its whole exploration of meaning and social media I found very relevant, especially considering this whole coronavirus situation, just the need to connect. As I'm in the house more often, as projects are kind of like dwindling because, you know, everyone's not working, which is fine, but like I'm not as busy, it kind of reminds me of this whole ordeal, and watching it in time with Pathologic, a similar game with similar systems in a sense. The bottom line is, what I like most about the world of Death Stranding is kind of its hybrid of sci-fi and contemporary with old imagery. I think that past, present, future dynamic in the game is really strong, and Yoji Shinkawa deserves as much credit as Kojima in that department since he's their art director. Kudos to him for a really well-realized artistic direction. But yeah, I think that's gonna be it, so thank you so much for watching. Stay healthy, and stay tuned for more as it comes. It's so weird because like I'm simultaneously not as busy and just as busy, but in other ways. It's all weird. I think we all can accept that and all understand each other in that regard, so that's a good thing. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I will see you all later. Thanks for watching.